Within the activities at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, the U.S. side has had a series of bilateral and multilateral meetings with partners and allies throughout Asia. The first was a quadrilateral meeting of the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. This was followed by the launch of a real-time intelligence sharing mechanism with Japan and South Korea, among many other meetings. However, all is overshadowed by the lack of connection with China. The only interaction was 5-second handshake between Minister Austin and his Chinese counterpart Li Shangfu on June the 2nd. The next morning, Mr. Austin said, "An evening handshake is no substitute for substantive bonding." According to some experts, these activities show that the U.S. strategy with China may continue to seek in-depth dialogue, but still constantly strengthen the network of allies in Asia in order to restrict the actions that are considered dangerous from Beijing. On June the 4th, in his speech at the Shangri-La Forum, China's Defense Minister Li Shangfu said that Beijing wants to stabilize bilateral relations and pointed out it is the United States that must be responsible for the lack of dialogue between two countries. He said China seeks to develop relations with the U.S. based on the responsibilities of the two big countries. On the U.S. side, they need sincere actions, words and deeds, and practical participation with China to stabilize relations to prevent the current situation from deteriorating further. Mr. Li noted that mutual respect should be followed rather than bullying and hegemony. The U.S. sanctions against China are the root cause of the lack of connection between the defense leadership of two countries. Mr. Li himself was also sanctioned by the U.S. for participating in the purchase of a fighter jet and surface-to-air missile defense systems from Russia in 2018. Meanwhile, China has taken small steps toward reconciliation with Japan when Mr. Li met with Defense Minister Yasukazu Hamada. Perhaps to create atmosphere for the meeting, China halted the daily operations of the Coast Guard in the waters off the Senkaku Islands, administered by Japan. China also claims and calls it Diaoyu. Over the years, China's tactic has constantly sent ships to harass in the waters around Senkaku Islands with the aim of making Japan tired of dealing with. This is considered a gray zone strategy, turning a non-disputed place into a dispute, and when the other side has a loophole, China will turn the disputed area into China territory through a quick action. Data released by the Japanese Coast Guard show that no Chinese ships entered the waters of Senkaku between May the 13th and June the 2nd, a rare silence. Minister Austin posted many tweets on June the 4th to highlight the achievements in Singapore. For example, the three-way conversation with his Japanese and Korean counterparts were very productive. The United States, Japan, and South Korea have agreed to launch a system that allows real-time intelligence sharing on North Korea's ballistic missile program. The trilateral cooperation demonstrates Tokyo and Seoul's commitment to prioritizing security initiatives rather than arguing over issues dating back to World War II. Mr. Austin also held the first defense ministerial meeting with his counterparts from Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. All discussed a new security architecture aimed at monitoring and controlling China's actions in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. It was a major milestone marking a step forward in maritime cooperation between the four countries. The US, Japan, and Australia are in the Quad. The Philippines, since President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. came to power, has strongly shifted to security cooperations with the U.S. Under growing pressure from China, Manila agreed to lease 4 more military bases to the U.S., including in the north opposite to Taiwan Islands. This is considered a preparation of the two countries in case the Taiwan Strait war breaks out. The U.S. side believes that one day the Philippines will become an important link in the security strategy that Washington is increasingly turning to Asia. The U.S. especially needs the important position of the Philippines archipelago. The lack of cohesion between the US and China at the Shangri-La Defense Dialogue also shows the tense atmosphere at sea. On June the 3rd, the US-guided missile destroyer USS Zhonghong and the frigate HMCS Montreal of the Royal Canadian Navy were conducting a freedom of navigation operation in the Taiwan Strait. Then a Chinese warship rushed only about 135 meters from the American ship. Canada's Global News newspaper, with a reporter traveling on the Montreal frigate, recorded a near collision since the newspaper reported that the ship of the People's Liberation Army of China accelerated significantly and cut across the bow of the Zhonghong. Captain Paul Montfort from the Canadian warship commanded this action was unprofessional. The U.S. military confirmed the encounter and accused the Chinese vessel of acting unsafely. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command also announced that the Chinese ship had passed the Zhonghong from the left side, with a distance of 150 meters. The Zhonghong maintained its direction but reduced its speed by 10 knots per hour to avoid a collision. Mark Esper, former U.S. Secretary of Defense, shared in a recent interview that the lack of communication between the U.S. and China is an obstacle to the establishment of a crisis resolution mechanism. For example, when an American drone collided with a Russian fighter jet over the Black Sea in March 2023, Austin spoke with his Russian counterpart Sergei Shoigu shortly after. But when U.S. warplane shot down a Chinese surveillance balloon off the coast of South Carolina in February, Beijing rejected Austin's call. Mr. Esper continued, there has been a long tradition of communication between the leaders of Russia and the United States at the civilian and military levels, dating back to the Cold War. That mechanism was established decades ago. We haven't got the same with China. Eli Rotner, the Pentagon's top official for the Indo-Pacific, said at an event hosted by the Center for the Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, last month, that communication channels between the US and Russia were the result of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The missile crisis was a time when the United States and the Soviet Union came closer to a nuclear war. That harsh reality forced both of them to realize the importance of maintaining lines of communication at all times, including while the war was raging in Ukraine. Mr. Ratner said the question for China now is, do we need to go through a major crisis before establishing a serious communication mechanism? Our idea is let's do it now. The lack of defense talks in part stems from a conflict of intentions between the US and China. Initially, Mr. Austin wanted to promote a new communication channel with a vice chairman of China's powerful Central Military Commission. As part of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, the Central Military Commission is the top decision-making body on national defense matters. The vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, behind President Xi Jinping, usually oversees the day-to-day operations of the People's Liberation Army and has far more power than the defense minister. Mr. Austin considered the vice chairman of China's Central Military Commission as a target for dialogue, but according to some sources, the effort has failed. Eric Sayers, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, warned that the lack of dialogue could hinder other policies related to China. He continued, China has been trying to signal to Washington through various channels that conflict over Taiwan is possible. So dialogue is necessary, but it is also willing to choose to stop the dialogue until Washington changes course, especially on policies that Beijing disagrees with. Despite China's rejection of dialogue, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin on June the 3rd stressed the importance of negotiations, calling dialogue essential to avoid misunderstandings. For responsible leaders, the right time to talk is anytime or now. The U.S. Defense Secretary delivered a keynote address at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which brings together more than 600 delegates from 40 countries to discuss security and geopolitical challenges in Asia. He noted the recent incident of aggressive and unprofessional Chinese ships in international waters and airspace. He continued, Beijing continues to conduct dangerous intercepts of U.S. and allied aircraft that are legally operating in international airspace. We will support allies and partners, allowing them to defend themselves against coercion and bullying. According to him, the United States will not be deterred by dangerous actions in international airspace. Days after a declassified video was released, showing a Chinese fighter jet doing what the U.S. Pacific Ocean Command called unnecessary aggression when it intercepted an U.S. aircraft. The U.S. side added that the incident happened over the East Sea in international airspace. China responded by demanding that the U.S. stop such flights. The United States will maintain a strong and responsible presence throughout the Indo-Pacific and will continue to work to ensure that no single country has control of common waterways. He continued, in the South China Sea, we will continue to work with allies and partners to protect freedom of navigation and overflight. I would like to emphasize once again the importance of the 2016 decision of the International Court of Arbitration. It is legally binding and final. In 2016, an international arbitration court ruled that China's historical argument on which to base the nine-dash line in the South China Sea is groundless and has no legal validity. On the Taiwan Strait issue, Austin said the United States remains strongly committed to maintaining the status quo, being consistent with the One China policy and fulfilling its obligations under the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act, a U.S. law that compels Washington to provide Taiwan equipment to defend itself. Mr. Austin believes that the world has an interest in maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. The security of trade routes and global supply chains all depend on it. However, he commented that Taiwan is one of the thorniest issues in the U.S.-China relation today. According to him, open lines of communication with China are essential, especially between defense leaders. He concluded in his speech, I am deeply concerned that China is not ready to engage more seriously in crisis management mechanisms between the militaries of two countries, but I hope that it will change soon. A senior U.S. State Department official went to Beijing on June the 4th, seeking to strengthen communication with China at a time of heightened tension between two countries. The trip by the U.S. State Department's Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs, Daniel Crittenbrink, was expected to discuss key issues in bilateral relations. Joining the trip was the Director of the National Security Council in charge of China and Taiwan affairs, Ms. Sarah Baran. Relations between the world's two largest economies are currently strained over issues ranging from human rights records, Taiwan to military activity in the East and South China Seas. Recently, China refused to hold a meeting between the two defense ministers at the Shangri-La Dialogue. Crittenbrink's trip suggested that the U.S. wants dialogue to be restarted from the State Department, not the Pentagon. After his visit to China, Mr. Crittenbrink will travel to New Zealand to participate in the U.S.-New Zealand Strategic Dialogue, which aims to strengthen links between the two allies to deal with new challenges. The international situation has many complicated developments. New Zealand also recently announced that it will drastically increase its defense budget, invest in seaports, plus retrofit warships. A spokesman for the U.S. State Department said that Crittenbrink's official meetings with the Chinese side began on June the 5th. In Beijing, Mr. Crittenbrink raised the issue of human rights and continued to advocate for the basic freedoms of the people in China. In addition, he also expressed concern about China's action in the East and South China Seas, which Washington considers dangerous to freedom of navigation as well as threatening international law. Crittenbrink's appearance coincided with the anniversary of Tiananmen Square events in 1989. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken released a statement marking the anniversary of the event, saying, "The bravery of the victims will not be forgotten and continue to inspire freedom advocates around the world." Discussing the 1989 Tiananmen Square as a taboo in China and heavily censored on social media, Mr. Kristen Brink's trip follows a visit to China in May by CIA Director William Burns. A U.S. official said Mr. Burns emphasized the importance of maintaining open lines of communication between the intelligence communities of two countries. Secretary of State Blinken has postponed a planned February trip to China after a Chinese spy balloon allegedly flew over U.S. airspace over sensitive military site, sparkling a diplomatic crisis. This air balloon was later shot down. But the White House said it was working to resume Blinken's visit to China, as well as future trips by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo. The U.S.-China relationship is the lowest and most complicated stage since the diplomatic reconnection in 1972. Overall, the U.S. is maintaining two parallel policies, that is strengthening alliance in Asia to isolate China, while hoping to promote dialogue with Beijing. When it comes to interest, China responds by limiting communication between two countries. According to experts, if the two most powerful countries in the world cannot talk to each other, it would greatly affect cooperation not only bilaterally, but also a series of global issues such as economic recovery after the pandemic, combat climate change, and prevent global warming. How long will this icy atmosphere last, and what will the future of U.S.-China relations look like? Please follow our later programs. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.